The Chronicles of Narnia are some of the most beloved books of all time, and written by perhaps one of the most recognizable and influential writers of the 20th century, C.S. Lewis himself. Despite the high praise that the series has received since its original publication, however, C.S. Lewis's own friend, j.r.r. Tolkien, was seemingly very critical of his friend's work for a variety of reasons. In this video, we'll explore j.r.r. Tolkien's views on Narnia through his own words and examine precisely why Tolkien hated the Chronicles of Narnia. C.S. Lewis was always vocal in his praise of The Lord of the Rings, and as a man very close to Tolkien, he was one of the most influential figures in the development of the book. Tolkien would share drafts of the trilogy with the Inklings and receive valuable feedback and constructive criticism, through which he was able to make the book better. The same was the case where Narnia was concerned, though differences between the two men in matters of both literary taste and religion, in combination with a friendship that grew more and more distant, Tolkien's reaction to Narnia was, to put it plainly, negative. Tolkien was a lover of myths, and it was his sincere belief that it was partly through myths that truth could be revealed. Therefore, he held much respect for them and for fairy tales, which he felt were being gradually degraded in modern society, debased for children. Thus, on a surface literary level at least, Tolkien was against what he perceived the whimsical mixing of myths and fantastical figures from different times and places, which he felt was inconsistent and generally not to his liking as a reader. When it came to Narnia specifically, he was particularly opposed, for example, to the inclusion of a figure like Father Christmas to a story that also famously featured creatures like fauns and dragons. Tolkien's standards for myths were so high that in his own world there had to be a consistent narrative, background and lore that explained the existence of each of his races, as well as their mutual interactions. He saw Narnia as something rushed, as a work that simply used all of these different fantastical things, but without the necessary substance and thought-out narrative that Tolkien himself would have expected, and without being serious enough about its secondary world. Another thing that Tolkien was notably against was that Lewis also changed the natures of the creatures that featured in his stories, while simply maintaining their appearance and names for recognition. A notable example of this was removing lust from the traditional archetype of the fauns, something that Tolkien criticized and must have equated with his opinions on other fantasy creatures becoming more fitting for children, such as the dwarves in the hands of Disney. According to George Sayer, who knew C.S. Lewis and j.r.r. personally, Tolkien's original feedback to Narnia was particularly harsh. Lewis was hurt, astonished and discouraged when Tolkien said that he thought the book was almost worthless, that it seemed like a jumble of unrelated mythologies, because Aslan, the fauns, the White Witch, Father Christmas, the myths, and Mr. and Mrs. Beaver had quite distinct mythological or imaginative origins. Tolkien thought that it was a terrible mistake to put them together in Narnia, a single imaginative country. The effect was incongruous and, for him, painful. But Jack argued that they existed happily together in our minds in real life. Tolkien replied, "Not in mine, or at least not at the same time." Tolkien never changed his view. He so strongly detested Jack's assembling figures from various mythologies in his children's books that he soon gave up trying to read them. He also thought that they were carelessly and superficially written. His condemnation was so severe that one suspects he envied the speed with which Jack wrote, and compared it with his own laborious method of composition. Beyond what he perceived as a lack of depth in the world of Narnia, Tolkien is also quoted as describing the work about as bad as can be, and was also notably critical about the plot itself, feeling that there were inconsistencies to both the plot and the world as a whole that he attributed to the fast pace in which the books were being written. Whereas with his careful and exhaustive feedback on Out of the Silent Planet, Lewis and Tolkien were able to make improvements to the book, the visions of the two authors were too different when it came to Narnia, and their opinions could not be reconciled. In letter 32, Tolkien says that, "I read the story in the original MS, and was so enthralled that I could do nothing else until I had finished it. My first criticism was simply that it was too short. I still think that criticism holds for both practical and artistic reasons. Other criticisms concerning narrative style, inconsistent details in the plot, and philology have since been corrected to my satisfaction. The author holds to items of linguistic invention that do not appeal to me, but this is a matter of taste." Here we see a Tolkien that is, overall, satisfied enough with the premise of the book to be able to make viable feedback that Lewis can actually act upon. With Narnia, however, an ideal version of the book for Tolkien would be a Narnia unrecognizable to its actual author, and therefore there was nothing that could really be done. Tolkien was appalled by Lewis's use of myths. He thought the writing was too rushed, while Lewis thought Tolkien's writings was too slow. Tolkien was opposed to the changes Lewis made to the fantastical creatures, while Lewis thought that it was the author's right to do as he wished to achieve his vision, a vision Tolkien didn't like. Lastly, Lewis always maintained a childlike spirit throughout the writing, taking his secondary world a little less seriously at times, which in combination with everything so far led Tolkien to call Narnia worthless, and would be ultimately unable to truly assist with its writing, unlike Lewis's extensive constructive feedback on The Lord of the Rings. Despite everything so far, however, the biggest and ultimate reason why Tolkien disliked the Chronicles of Narnia was religion. C.S. Lewis, before meeting Tolkien and becoming friends, had fallen away from his Christian faith. Tolkien was actually the one that convinced Lewis that myths were indeed the way to the truth, and that the myth of Jesus Christ was the most important of all because it was the only myth that was itself true. To Tolkien's dismay, however, C.S. Lewis did not convert to Catholicism, but instead returned to the Anglican Church of Ireland, commencing a nearly legendary part of his life in which we see C.S. Lewis preach Christianity through his writings and speeches. Lewis, immersed back into his faith in Jesus, was not afraid to include Christian allegory in the majority of his writings, and most especially in the Chronicles of Narnia, in which Aslan is quite literally supposed to be Jesus himself. Tolkien, as a traditionalist Catholic author and reader, was not only opposed to the blatant allegory within Narnia on a literary level, but was also very against C.S. Lewis's own Protestantism and Anglican understanding of the faith, and by extension, it spreading through the work. Repeatedly in his letters, j.r.r. Tolkien voices his opposition to allegory of every type, and especially religious allegory. He thought the use of allegory took the freedom away from the reader to reach his own understanding in his own terms, instead forcing him down an uncreative path to reach the conclusions of the author. In The Fellowship of the Ring, Tolkien states that, "I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and always have done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. I think that many confuse applicability with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader and the other in the purposed domination of the author." Everything we've mentioned so far, in terms of the lacking mythological stories within Narnia, ultimately culminate in what Tolkien perceives as an overuse of allegory. In letter 265, Tolkien makes his feelings on Narnia and Lewis abundantly clear. "It is sad that Narnia and all that part of C.S. Lewis's work should remain outside the range of my sympathy, as much of my work was outside his. Also, I personally found Letters to Malcolm a distressing and in parts horrifying work. I began a commentary on it, but if finished it would not be publishable." Tolkien's sentiments specifically on the allegory present within the work are highlighted in a 1971 letter to Eileen Elgar, in which he comments that, "I am glad that you have discovered Narnia. These stories are deservedly very popular, but since you ask if I like them, I'm afraid the answer is no. I do not like allegory, and least of all, religious allegory of this kind. But that is a difference of taste which we both recognized and did not interfere with our friendship." While Tolkien was very critical of Narnia on pretty much all levels, from literature and plot to its religious themes, he did recognize some of its merits, and notably gifted a copy of the Narnia books to his granddaughter Joanna. From my understanding, it is possible that he was able to distinguish his own particular criticisms with the overall achievements of the books and of his friend, something that is also noted in the letter to Eileen, in which he states how glad he is that she had discovered them. The professor was never afraid to speak his mind to his close friend, and though he was critical of a lot of his literary endeavors, he was utterly devastated when Lewis passed away in 1963, and regretted that their friendship had cooled towards the end. Nonetheless, his comments were always made with the intention of betterment, and Tolkien was also sure not to say anything publicly against his friend's work, regardless of his disagreement or dislike. A massive thank you to my channel members, and thank you very much for watching.